This is into the Wyrd and Wild by Charles Ferguson Avery. This kinda hit me out of the left field. Questing Beast made me aware that there is an OSR sale going on Drive-Thru-RPG, so I thought, okay, let's see on my wish list what is discounted, and this struck me. I couldn't remember why I put it on the wish list, but it's got great review. It was only $12 and it looked very interesting, so I got it and looked into it, and I love it. Let me tell you why this is great. Let's start in the back. Further reading. So this is like the Appendix N from original D&D. This is inspiration that the author had when writing this. This is something you can read, watch, and play to get inspiration for your own RPG games. And in here is Bloodborne, which is one of my favorite video games of all time. Call of the Wild by Jack London, which I think I read as a teenager. Dark Souls, which I played to death, also one of my favorite video games of all time. The Locked Tomb trilogy, which I recently read, at least the first 2 books. The Revenant, I didn't read the book, but I really liked the movie. And there's a streak in here of wilderness, adventure, and horror. And this is basically what this is. This calls itself a supplement. System neutral supplement, though it is most easy to implement into old school D&D, but you could also implement it into 5e or with a bit of work any other system. And while this calls itself a supplement, a wilderness supplement, this is almost a complete campaign setting. Let me show you what you will find in there. So most of the art in this book is of this kind of rough style that might not be everyone's cup of tea, but I personally like it. It's evocative. Especially the black and white high contrast illustrations that play with the very limited light that you have in a dark forest. I think these are great to set the mood. Start with the actual content. Rules of Wilding Way. So these are wilderness travel and survival rules. And these are very usable. A bit abstract, maybe. For example, the rule of gold. So this abstracts water, food, and fuel for fires into just supply. And one supply is about enough to survive for a day. More to that later. And you could buy that for 1 gold piece. Or if you play a setting where gold is of much higher worth, then one supply would be 1 silver piece. Now this might be a bit abstract, but it streamlines the process of rules for wilderness survival. When you go foraging, when you go hunting, when you find something, it can always just be translated into supplies, and you can keep track of supplies. And if you find a merchant, if you find an outpost, you can trade for supplies and you can pay with supplies. In a frontier wilderness setting, there would be a lot of bartering going on instead of exchange of actual coin. So using supply instead of gold is kind of setting appropriate. Exhaustion rules, and instead of just gaining levels of exhaustion, anytime you gain exhaustion, You roll on this D8 table and get a different effect until you gain 4 levels or equal to your level or more, and then you die from exhaustion. So this is the wild, the wilderness wearing you down with cold, long distances, hunger and thirst. This is the great killer in this setting, and your supplies are what keeps the exhaustion away. So these rules, once again, a bit abstract but very usable. Surviving the night. Here, rules as written, you roll 3d6. 1d6 for each of the 3 cardinal needs for survival: food, water and shelter. And you've got a 50% chance of success, 4 to 6 on a d6. If you have proficiency in hunting, foraging or survival or something like that, any wilderness skill, you roll with advantage. So you roll the d6 twice and take the better roll. And then depending on how many successes you have no gains of losses if you do really well. If you do really well in these rolls, you're just content. Then if you only have 2, you're scraping by. 1 member gains 1 level of exhaustion. So if you're only scraping by, you can take turns gaining exhaustion. Or you've got bad times. 1 level exhaustion for all. And finally suffering, you have nothing. 2 levels of exhaustion for all. You can see how this will add up if you're traveling days and weeks in the wilderness. But instead of suffering this exhaustion, you can use up your supplies and buy yourself successes. So if you have, like in this example, only 1 success, each member of the party can pay 1 supply to make one of the lower rolls a success. So if everyone in this example were to pay 1 supply, they would go to scraping by. 1 member gains 1 level of exhaustion. Or what you could also do, every member of your party but 1 pays 2 supplies to go to content, no gains or losses. And then the remaining member can conserve supplies and suffer 1 level of exhaustion. And depending on how big your party is, there's an optimal way of doing this. One of the main ways to gain supplies is to go hunting for animals or monsters. Once again, we've got rather abstract but usable rules in here. Depending on the type of game you're hunting, you need to gain a number of marks. So for a simple game like, I don't know, a rabbit, 1 or 2 marks. Uncommon big game, trophy beasts or big stag or boar, 3 to 9 marks. Rare, monsters and apex predators, so grizzly bears or worse, 10 to 20 marks. And finally mystic, legendary creatures, maybe a green dragon or something, 24 marks. And to gain marks, you go through the process of rolling a d6 each day to see how well you're doing. So if you roll high, you get marks, double marks, or even double marks and a boon. And if you roll bad, you get a mark and a minor setback, or no mark and a minor setback, or even a major setback. And we've got tables for these setbacks and for these boons, and if that happens, you will have to deal with that. Maybe you get into a fight, maybe you get hurt, maybe you're gaining exhaustion, maybe you're using up supplies. You have to deal with it until you find your quarry. And once you find it, once you kill it, more importantly, you can start carving up the body. The mechanic here is If you want to clean a body, you decide what kind of cleaning you want to do. If you only do crude cleaning, you only have to roll a 2 or higher on a d6, but if you want to do a surgical dissection, you must roll a 6 or higher. If your character is trained in a task like this, if it fits into their class or if they've got proficiency, they roll at advantage. So you see a theme here. These are not classical skill checks. I mean, you could substitute classical skill checks for this, but instead you've got mechanic you can use instead of a skill check that gives you a difficulty depending on the task and takes characters' proficiency into consideration, but not at all their level. So you don't have to adjust the difficulty as the characters go up in level to keep this a challenge. But if you're playing 5e, you might want to exchange these d6 rolls for skill checks or skill challenges instead. So once you've chosen what type of cleaning you want to do, roll 1d6 per 100 pounds of flesh. So if you've got a big body to work with, you have more chances of carving up something nice. And if your roll is successful, you see, depending on what type you do, what kind of reward you get. Common goods are usually flesh and meat. These would be just supplies. Uncommon goods, you've got a d10 random table in here, so that could be a fresh heart, an unscathed skull. And random or rare goods, you've got a d10 table in here, a brain that seems to whisper. So these might be neat to use for something else, or trade in the next town, trade with the next caravan you come across for a huge amount of supply. So especially if you have killed a bigger beast, a rare mystic beast, it will be worth doing the efficient cleaning, the thorough cleaning, maybe even the surgical dissection. And then take your time. For each extra hour you take to clean a piece of flesh, you can add 1 to the dice roll. But time also means you are spending more time at the cadaver, more time in the wilderness. Maybe you have to camp, you have to survive through the night. If it is a legendary beast you have just slain, you probably want to spend the time to get the uncommon and rare goods from it. The moon phases. This gives some like environmental effects depending on the phase of the moon. In folklore, the moon has always been an important factor, like werewolves that only come out on the full moon. And you can start here with a random moon phase, and this also gives you the effect of that moon phase. But after that you should track this as a GM, and the players might want to keep track of this so they know what effect they can be expecting. It is set up like this. The fuller the moon, the wilder and more dangerous the wilderness becomes. So if you've got a new moon, there's only a 1 in 6 chance of a wilderness encounter every day. But on the downside, there will be little game to encounter and will be very dark in the night, so you've got disadvantage on hunting. Then waxing crescent, 2 in 6 chance of wilderness encounters. Half full, 3 in 6 chance of wilderness encounter every day. Waxing gibbous, 4 in 6. Full moon, 5 in 6 chance. And you will also be able to see in the dark of night by the light of the full moon, and then the chance of wilderness encounter goes down again. So maybe if it is a full moon outside, you wait for a few more days in a safe harbor until you set out into the wild. Then we've got also special moons that may happen randomly or at set points around the year, or maybe this is the result of some cult ritual or some god intervention. So we've got the blood moon. The land is smothered in a ghastly red glow. The sound of beasts and animals drift through the air that smells faintly of copper and blood. Double chance of wilderness encounters. The demented moon rolls against madness or mind-affecting effects are at disadvantage. And we've got a number of these. We also got a D10 random table to create a moon or several moons for our campaign world with name and description. And if you roll a 10, you'll get twin moons. Roll again for each other. So this could be Mane, large as a wagon wheel, a bright yellow glow, seems to give off warmth when full. This is one of the reasons why I think of this more like almost a campaign setting, because there are these tools provided to create the campaign world. If you already got a setting, you probably already know what kind of moon or moons hang in the sky and what the names are. But if you are preparing a campaign, this is a great table. And we've got the Call of the Wild. This is a slow transformation into something not quite human by the influence of the Wyrd. So possible triggers, there could be more, but these are possibilities. You don't have to use all of them too. Spending more than a month in the wild without contact with civilization. Dropping to 0 hit points, so even if you survive that, the experience will leave you changed. Becoming infected with a terrible disease. 4 levels of exhaustion. Consuming the flesh of another intelligent being. If you're running out of supplies, and that might be the only way to survive, I can see that happening. And if you've done it once, the second time is probably easier. Then we've got a D50 random table with mutations and other effects the Wyrd might have on you. You read by eating. Written language makes no sense to you anymore. You instead comprehend words and writing by eating them. Each book, scroll, or written word you eat is immediately comprehended as you had just read it. So you're literally becoming a bookworm. So these are strange. They might be of benefit, they might be of detriment, but they will all change your characters in some fundamental way. And once again, I think this is more than just a supplement. This is setting. This tells you that in this setting, the wilderness has a transformative, chaotic, magic presence or aura that will reshape and transform people of order and civilization that spend too much time in here. This also tells you what kind of transformations to expect. Then we've got becoming lost. If you're navigating the wilds, if you're going off the beaten path, this might be a real danger, mostly because you're losing a lot of time to find your way again. And that might make you spend more nights in the wild, or even more days in the wild. And this will mean you will gain exhaustion, you will use up supplies, you have more danger for Call of the Wild. So becoming lost is a big danger in this setting. For your navigation roll, it depends on basically your equipment. If you've got a good map and a compass, or if you've got known location, known landmarks you're traveling to, +1. A guide or local to the area, +2. If your character has the skill and proficiency in navigation or survival, you roll with advantage. And the thing with this roll is you roll a d6 as usual in this system, but only the 6 is a success. If you've got a map, 5 and 6 is a success. So in total you can gain +3 to your roll, meaning there's still a good chance of getting lost. And then when you're lost, it depends on where you are navigating through, how much time you will lose. So if you're going through reputable woods, you're only lost for 1d6 hours, not too bad. If you're going through true wilderness, 1d6 times 6 hours. This can quickly become a day or two. Dangerous wilds, 1d10 times 6 hours. Utterly deadly wilderness, 1d10 days. And after you've spent this time finding your way again, you got random return locations. Exactly where you started, which is convenient, then you can roll again if you find your way. A ruined camp containing corpses of dead adventurers and some of their goods, which is even better. Well, not for them, but for you. Or something like a shack with a sect of crazed monks, there for strange meat and dark stories. Which is a bit weird, but it's a safe place and you might be able to trade in for more supplies. Or rest for a few days after you've been lost for so long that you've gained a lot of exhaustion. So this, once again, very abstract rules, but very usable, and they highlight the dangers of the wilderness. Madness. If you've played Call of Cthulhu, Darkest Dungeons, or Bloodborne, you will know that madness is a big part of these horror settings. That the stress and knowing the terrible secrets of the world is too much for a mortal mind to bear. And if the mind breaks, you might develop maybe just a quirk or a mad, crazed action or thought. And this is, once again, more setting than rule. So this would latch on to whatever stress mechanic your game is using. Then if the stress is triggered, if they fail wisdom rolls, or if they lose too much sanity, you can roll on these tables to see what happens, or add these effects to the tables you're already using. These are setting specific symptoms of madness. For example, we've got the Totem Maker. You spend your free time creating elaborate, albeit grotesque effigies of creatures and deities. Or filthy. You find no reason to bathe or groom yourself. These are symptoms that make the characters more a part of the weird and the wild. For example, Into the Dark. There's something hidden deep in the wilds. You know it. You have to press on. You have to find what's hiding in the dark. Or I'm Home. The world makes no sense. The laws and trivial customs are just thin masks over reality. The wilds make much more sense. You will never leave it or set foot in civilized ground ever again. You are finally home. And you can use one, several, or all of these rules to give a setting you already have a more weird and wild feeling to it. Make wilderness travel and survival more dangerous, but also more interesting. This is one of the things I love about old school D20 is how modular everything is. You can put rules together and leave rules out as you see fit, and it usually still works. After this rule section, we've got a bestiary. These are often horrible creatures, often word creatures, and often dangerous creatures. And once again, I think this is setting. These are creatures that you would encounter in these Wyrd woods. And they might not make much sense in another setting. Also notice that these come with uncommon or rare goods you can find from these creatures when cleaning the body. And I like a lot of these creatures. I could totally see them in a game of Bloodborne or Dark Souls. And some of them are a bit whimsical, I find. But you've got a good selection of monsters you can include in your setting or leave out. Your decision. You decide on the tone you're looking for. Some of these monsters are also random generators to create a specific monster, which I love. And it's actually quite extensive. Quite extensive bestiary here. And we've got factions of the Wyrd and Wild, and this really just is setting. These are factions you can introduce as big players into your campaign world to make the campaign more Wyrd. There's the Court of Broken Branches, led by the Lady of Broken Branches, which is basically the goddess of the wild in this setting. So she would be responsible for the Wyrd and the random mutations, and she would have a court of creatures she has maybe helped in the past or even created. We've got the children of El Criomoran, which is animal hive mind, which would make even cute woodland critters kind of creepy. And we've got the Ruin. These were people at some point, but maybe they spent too much time in the wild, maybe they ate too much man flesh. Now they are mutated raiders and ravagers. They hunt down caravan, they burn down settlements, and they are a major threat to civilization as a whole. And we've got the wild elves, which are a bit more like goblins in this setting. These are the elves that will steal children and make milk turn sour. And if you're more a fan of Tolkien-like elves, then maybe call these goblins or kobolds or trolls, which could all be appropriate names for creatures such as these. They've got a strange life cycle. These are quite out there creatures. They are not too unsimilar from how elves work in Symbaroum, actually. Finally, for factions, we've got the Primal Wheel, which are the gods of the primal and wild world. Furthermore, we've got a section of artifacts that would be appropriate to this setting, and I already like alcohol and spirits. In this setting, people tend to abuse drugs and alcohols to cope with the dangers of the wild. And these work a bit like chemicals, so they have secondary side effects more than just getting drunk. For example, this Briar Blood beer, gain 1d10 temporary hit points. So might be a good idea of taking a bottle of this into the woods and drink it before a fight. We've got more than a page of different alcohols and spirits. This is followed by a number of weird artifacts you can introduce to the campaign works phase of the Maniac. These are all made from the flesh and bone of some humanoid or monster and pulsing with weird magic, weird effects. And we've got magic, so we got a number of spells that are appropriate to this setting. These are wild and horror themed magic. These are the magic of witches and deranged druids. Some are out there, all are very flavorful. I like these a lot. The Dungeon of Tree and Stone. This is two things. One, it is a concept of treating the wilderness like a dungeon. So instead of going into some cave or tomb, you stay in the woods, and the challenges you would normally face in a dungeon, you face in the woods. And this explains this concept for us as a dungeon, where the trails are your corridors, where the distance is a hazard. And then it gives you tools to generate these dungeons. And it starts by using one hex with several sub-hexes. You would decide on a dungeon entrance. Then you roll 1d8 to determine how many areas this section of the dungeon has. And then you just throw a number of d6 onto this hex. And depending where they land and what number is facing upwards, you place a different area, a different point of interest right where the dice landed. So a low number is a small area, a small point of interest, stump, a large puddle, and a high number is a big point of interest, like a ruined abbey or an acre of trees. Then you roll another d6 plus 1 for the number of path, and a d8 to determine the kind of path, if it is a well-traveled footpath, difficult, or maybe it is a hidden trail or something that is not, or something magical maybe. And like this, you have made a type of dungeon. You've got your points of interest with challenges maybe, and your corridors connecting them, and depending on the type of corridor, they present their own challenge. But the party could always decide to just go off the beaten path and try to reach a point of interest directly. And if they do that, you have the rules for getting lost in the woods. If you've done one hex, you can expand upon it if you want to form a bigger dungeon. And you can just go on doing this until you've got a mega dungeon, the World of Despair. I like this whole concept of using the wilderness as a dungeon. It makes the wilderness more than something you just travel between dungeons, but makes the wilderness itself the point of interest, makes it the dungeon. And I think that is a concept you have to at least keep in mind if you want to run a wilderness adventure. Then we've got wild flora. So once again, this is just setting. These are some plants and fungi you might find in the world. Setting appropriate. Bit out there, strange, maybe useful, maybe dangerous. Also got setting appropriate diseases, and these might be quite strange. There's like edge mites that will leave marks on your body that look like the scribbling of a mad wizard. To make the concept of dungeon complete, we've got a number of hazards and traps you can introduce to challenge your party. We've got a I search the body table, D50 table. Could be useful, could be strange, hopefully it supplies. Table for random trails and path. That will be very useful when you're creating the dungeon, or just to give a bit of flavor to otherwise mundane trip between dungeons. A random generator for creation of the wilderness dungeon, so we start with the names. Then we also have the danger that lurks in the dungeon and whatever secrets or treasures might be found. And I love me some random generators. We've got more random generator. I'll walk through the woods, wilderness scenes, types of wood, smells and sounds in the wood, a D50 encounter table. Finally, we've got 100 word locations. So these are points of interest you can put into your dungeon right out of the box. And once again, this is setting. This is what the author thinks you might encounter in the world. Got a lot of these, and they are once again very moody and flavorful. This, for example, is a scene straight up out of Dark Souls 2. I remember the first time seeing a knight sitting leaned to a tree, seemingly asleep, and then when I came too close, he stood up and proceeded to kick my ass 12 times in a row. The book closes off with the appendix. We've got a rules summary you can hand out to your players. Got this helpful sheet to create your wilderness dungeon, and once again the further reading. So as I said, this is a wilderness supplement, but I think it is almost a campaign setting. What this doesn't have is any part of your setting that has to do with civilization. So that is up to you as GM. Maybe put this into an existing setting, into a part of the world that is especially Wyrd, and then use the cultures and civilization and races and everything from this world. But you could also easily create a few towns and villages and the people that live there, and place them at the edge of a huge expanse of wild Wyrd frontier. Depending on what you are in the mood for, you could run this like a game of Monster Hunter. Don't use the rules for madness, don't make the exploration too dangerous, and instead the characters go out there hunting for legendary beasts and then carving them up to make new weapons and armors and potions to go hunting for even bigger legendary beasts. Or run this as a kind of frontier horror, where there are only small towns that are barely scraping a living from this weird and wild and dangerous land. Give your characters some trick weapons, some power weapons, but these would come from maybe overseas, only be built in one town and one workshop, and if they go out into the wild, they will have to keep track of their ammunition and maybe improvise a bone spear, or run it like darkest dungeons where there are dark secrets to to be uncovered in the ruins strewn throughout the wild, and if the characters delve in there, they will not come out the same if they come out at all. So yeah, into the Wyrd and Wild. I think it's a great supplement for any game that deals with wilderness, survival and adventure. But more than that, I think it's a great starting point for an entire Wyrd campaign. Thanks for watching and goodbye.